My name is Jibril. I'm 34 years old, and on August 11, 2017, I was tied to railway tracks by my own Taliban unit and left to die. The 347 cargo train was bearing down on me at full speed. What happened next changed everything I believed about God, Jesus, and miracles. I was born in a village so remote that most maps don't even show it, nestled in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, where the winter winds cut through you like knives. My father was the local Taliban commander, a man whose word was law and whose anger was legendary. From the moment I could walk, he taught me that Islam was not just our faith, but our identity, our purpose, our very reason for existing. Christians were enemies of Allah, he would tell me as we sat by the fire each night. Infidels who had corrupted the true message of God. By the time I turned 16, I had memorized the Quran and could field strip an AK-47 in under 2 minutes. My father handed me my first rifle on my birthday, the metal still warm from the forge where the village blacksmith had engraved my name into the stock. "You are a soldier of Allah now," he said, his weathered hands gripping my shoulders. That rifle became an extension of my body, and the Taliban became my brotherhood. For 9 years, I lived this life without question. We controlled 3 villages, collected taxes, enforced Islamic law, and fought against the government forces who occasionally ventured into our territory. I became one of my father's most trusted lieutenants, known for my loyalty and my skill in combat. The other men respected me not just because of my father's position, but because I had earned it through blood and dedication. Everything changed in March of 2016, when a convoy of aid workers was attacked on the mountain road. We found their overturned vehicles and expected to discover the usual suspects: government spies or foreign soldiers disguised as civilians. Instead, we found 3 Western doctors and 2 Afghan nurses, all of them bleeding and broken, but still alive. My father's orders were simple: interrogate them for information, then execute them as enemies of the state. But something happened that I had never witnessed before. When we brought the wounded government soldiers from the same attack to their makeshift medical station, these Christian aid workers treated them with the same care and gentleness they showed each other. I watched a blonde woman with kind eyes stitch up a Taliban fighter who had been cursing her moments before. Her hands never shook, her voice never wavered, and when he spat in her face, she simply wiped it away and continued her work. "Why do you help those who hate you?" I asked her in broken English. She looked up at me with eyes that seemed to see straight into my soul. "Because Jesus taught us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us." Those words echoed in my mind for weeks after we released them. Love your enemies. In all my years of Islamic teaching, I had heard about justice, about righteousness, about the duty to fight for Allah. But love for enemies? This was something entirely foreign, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about God and faith and human nature. I began asking questions, carefully and quietly. When we captured Christians during raids, instead of simply guarding them, I would engage them in conversation. "Tell me about this Jesus," I would ask. "What makes you believe he was more than just a prophet?" Their answers confused me because they spoke not of conquest or dominion, but of forgiveness and sacrifice and love that transcended understanding. In the ruins of a bombed church outside Jalalabad, I found something that would change my life forever. Hidden beneath a pile of rubble and debris was a book, its pages torn and stained, but still readable. It was a Bible, translated into Dari, and as I held it in my hands, I felt something I can only describe as electricity running through my fingers. I stuffed it inside my jacket and smuggled it back to my bunker. Night after night, by the light of a small oil lamp, I read the words of Jesus. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. These teachings were so radically different from everything I had been taught about strength and power and dominance. Here was a man who claimed to be the Son of God. Yet he washed the feet of his disciples and prayed for those who crucified him. The more I read, the more restless I became. During our daily prayers, I found myself thinking about Jesus instead of focusing on the prescribed words. When my father spoke about crushing our enemies, I remembered Jesus telling his followers to turn the other cheek. The contradiction was tearing me apart from the inside, creating a war in my soul that was more violent than any physical battle I had ever fought. In December of 2016, we captured a Christian teacher who had been secretly educating girls in a neighboring village. He was maybe 40 years old, with grey streaking his beard and scars on his hands that spoke of hard labor. My father ordered me to guard him while they prepared for his execution. I expected him to beg for his life, to renounce his faith, to do anything to save himself. Instead, he asked me about my family, my hopes, my dreams. "Do you have children?" he asked me. "No," I replied, surprised by the question. "I have 3 daughters," he said, his voice soft with love. "They are the light of my world." I was teaching them and other girls to read so they could discover the beautiful world that God created for them. "Your God," I spat, trying to maintain my composure. "Your false God, who cannot even save you from death." He smiled then, a smile so peaceful and genuine that it unsettled me more than any threat could have. My God already saved me from death, young man. He saved me from spiritual death when I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior. Whatever happens to my body tomorrow is temporary. My soul belongs to Him for eternity. That night, alone in my bunker, with a hidden Bible open before me, I did something I had never done before. I spoke to Jesus directly, not as an enemy or a false prophet, but as someone seeking truth. "If you are real," I whispered into the darkness, "if you truly are the Son of God, then help me understand. Show me what is true." What happened in those quiet moments was impossible to describe to anyone who has not experienced it themselves. A peace settled over me that was deeper than anything I had ever felt. A sense of being known and loved that transcended all my fears and doubts and anger. For the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely at peace. The next morning, I watched them execute the Christian teacher. He prayed for his executioners until the very last moment, his lips moving in silent prayer even as the blade fell. I had seen many men die, but I had never seen anyone die with such peace, such absolute certainty of what awaited them beyond death. That image burned itself into my memory and refused to let go. From that day forward, I was a different man, though I tried desperately to hide it. I continued my duties, followed orders, maintained the facade of the loyal Taliban soldier. But inside, my heart belonged to Jesus Christ. I knew it was only a matter of time before this transformation would become visible to others, before my secret would be discovered. I just had no idea how dramatically that discovery would change everything. The moment that sealed my fate came on August 10, 2017, during what should have been a routine planning meeting in my father's compound. We were discussing an upcoming raid on a village suspected of harboring government sympathizers when the conversation turned to the Christian families living there. The brutality of the proposed plan made my stomach turn. They were talking about executing entire families, including children, simply because they refused to convert to Islam. I had managed to keep my growing faith hidden for 8 months, but as I listened to my comrades casually discuss the murder of innocent people, something inside me finally snapped. The words of Jesus echoed in my mind. "Suffer the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." I could no longer sit in silence while evil was planned in the name of religion. "Why must we kill the children?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "What threat do babies pose to our cause?" My father looked at me with surprise. In all my years as a Taliban fighter, I had never questioned our methods, never showed mercy toward enemies. "They will grow up to be Christians if we let them live," he said simply. "It is better to cut the tree at its roots." "But what if they are innocent?" I pressed, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. "What if God judges us for spilling innocent blood?" One of my closest friends, Ahmad, laughed harshly. "Since when do you care about Christian blood, Jibreel? Have you gone soft in your old age?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned to me. I knew I should have backed down, should have made some excuse about fatigue or stress. Instead, I found myself speaking words that would condemn me to death. "Maybe Jesus really is the Son of God," I said, my voice gaining strength as I spoke. "Maybe we are the ones who have been deceived." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that room full of hardened fighters. I watched as understanding dawned on their faces, followed quickly by disgust and rage. My father's expression went from confusion to horror to fury in the span of seconds. "What did you just say?" he whispered, his voice deadly quiet. I could have taken it back. I could have claimed it was a joke, a test of their faith, anything to defuse the situation. But 8 months of reading the Bible, 8 months of watching Jesus transform my heart, had changed me too completely. I could no longer deny what I had become. I said that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, I repeated, standing up to face them all. I believe he died for my sins and rose again. I believe he is the way, the truth, and the life. The explosion of rage that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Ahmad, who had been like a brother to me, struck me across the face so hard that I tasted blood. Others began shouting accusations, calling me an apostate, a traitor, a dog who had betrayed his own people. But it was my father's reaction that cut deepest. He stood slowly, his weathered face pale with shock and shame. "You are no son of mine," he said, his voice breaking. "You have brought disgrace upon our family name, upon our ancestors, upon everything we have fought and died for." Within minutes, I was surrounded by rifles pointed at my chest. These men who had been my brothers in arms, who had shared meals and stories and battles with me, now looked at me with murder in their eyes. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it felt like watching a nightmare unfold. They bound my hands behind my back with rope that cut into my wrists, the same rope we used to tie prisoners. The irony was not lost on me. Ahmad, his face still twisted with rage and betrayal, pulled the knot so tight that my fingers began to go numb within minutes. "How long?" my father demanded, his voice hollow. "How long have you been deceiving us?" 8 months, I admitted, seeing no point in lying now. "Since we found the Bible in the church ruins." The admission sent another wave of fury through the room. They had trusted me with their plans, their secrets, their lives, and all the while I had been what they considered an enemy agent. In their minds, I had been spying on them, preparing to betray them to the government or to Western forces. My father turned away from me, unable to look at his son any longer. "Take him to the storage shed," he ordered. "Lock him up, while we decide his fate. As they dragged me away, I caught sight of my mother peering around the corner, her face streaked with tears. "My son is dead to me," she whispered, but I could hear the anguish in her voice. In Afghan culture, to have a child convert to Christianity was a shame beyond description, a stain that would mark our family for generations. The storage shed was dark and cold, smelling of old grain and motor oil. They chained my feet to a metal post and left me there with nothing but my thoughts and my prayers. Through the thin walls, I could hear them arguing about what to do with me. Some wanted immediate execution. Others suggested turning me over to the religious authorities for a formal trial. But it was my father's voice that carried the most weight, and his decision was the cruelest of all. "We will make an example of him," I heard him say, his voice steady but broken. "We will tie him to the railway tracks and let the train kill him. If his Christian God wants to save him, let him prove his power." The finality of those words hit me like a physical blow. I had always known that conversion from Islam carried a death sentence, but hearing my own father pronounce it made it real in a way that nothing else could. I was going to die, and I was going to die in the most public, humiliating way possible. That night was the longest of my life. Chained in the darkness, facing certain death in less than 24 hours, I wrestled with every doubt and fear you can imagine. Had I made a terrible mistake? Was Jesus real, or had I been deceived by clever words and emotional manipulation? Would God really allow me to die for believing in him? I prayed more desperately that night than I had ever prayed in my life. Not the ritual prayers of Islam that I had recited thousands of times, but raw, honest conversation with a God I hoped was listening. "Jesus," I whispered into the darkness, "if you are truly who you claim to be, then I need you now. I'm going to die tomorrow for believing in you. Please do not let it be in vain." But even as I prayed for salvation, I found myself also praying for my family and friends. Despite their betrayal, despite their readiness to kill me, I understood their anger. In their minds, I had abandoned everything they held sacred. I was a traitor not just to our cause, but to our entire way of life. As dawn broke through the small window of the shed, I heard footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and Ahmad entered with 2 other fighters. His eyes were red, as if he had been crying, but his face was set with grim determination. "It is time," he said simply. They unchained my feet, but left my hands bound. As we walked toward the door, Ahmad grabbed my arm and pulled me close. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why did you do this to us? To yourself?" I looked into the eyes of my oldest friend and saw genuine pain there. "Because I found the truth," I said softly. "And once you find it, you cannot pretend it does not exist." He shook his head sadly and pushed me toward the door. Outside, the entire village seemed to be gathering. Word of my conversion had spread overnight, and people were coming from miles around to witness the execution of the Taliban fighter who had become a Christian. My mother stood near our house, supported by 2 women from the village. When she saw me, she began wailing, a sound that tore at my heart more than any physical torture could have. My father stood with the other commanders, his face a mask of stone. He would not look at me. The march to the railway tracks began at noon, with the entire village following behind like a funeral procession. Children ran alongside, chattering excitedly about the spectacle they were about to witness. Elderly men shook their heads and muttered prayers. Women wept, whether for me or for the shame I had brought upon my family, I could not tell. As we walked, I found myself thinking about the Christian teacher who had died with such peace months before. Would I be able to face death with the same courage? Would Jesus be with me in my final moments? Or would I die alone and abandoned? The railway tracks stretched across the valley like a scar, black metal rails that had carried trains for decades. This was where my story would end, where my faith would be tested in the most final way possible. As they prepared the ropes that would bind me to those tracks, I closed my eyes and prayed one last time for a miracle I did not dare to expect. The march to the railway tracks began at exactly 2:30 p.m. on August 11th, 2017. I know the time precisely because my father made a point of checking his watch and announcing it to the crowd that had gathered to witness my execution. "The train comes at 3:47, he declared, his voice carrying across the assembled villagers. "We have exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes to prepare this apostate for judgment." As they dragged me from the storage shed, my legs nearly buckled beneath me. I had not eaten in over 24 hours, and the combination of fear, dehydration, and spiritual turmoil had left me weak and disoriented. But the crowd's energy was electric, feeding off the spectacle of a Taliban commander's son being executed for converting to Christianity. Some faces showed genuine sorrow, others barely contained excitement, but all of them seemed hungry for the drama that was about to unfold. The walk to the tracks felt both eternal and impossibly brief. Half a mile through the village streets, past the mosque where I had prayed 5 times daily for most of my life, past the school where I had first learned to read the Quran, past the market where vendors stopped their haggling to stare at the condemned man being led to his death. Children ran alongside our procession, their innocent faces bright with curiosity about what they were about to witness. My mother followed at a distance, supported by 2 village women who kept her from collapsing entirely. Every few steps, she would cry out my name, her voice breaking with anguish that cut through me like a knife. "My son, my beautiful son," she wailed. "Why did you abandon us for the infidels' God?" Her words were meant as accusation, but I could hear the love and desperation underneath them. Ahmad walked beside me, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. We had grown up together, learned to fight together, shared dreams of glory and paradise together. Now he was escorting me to my execution, and the weight of that responsibility was clearly crushing him. "You can still recant," he whispered to me as we approached the edge of the village. "Even now, if you renounce this madness and return to Islam, my father might show mercy." I turned to look at him, this friend who had been like a brother to me, and saw tears glistening in his eyes. "Would you renounce your faith to save your life?" I asked him quietly. He was silent for a long moment. "That is different," he finally said. "My faith is true." "So is mine," I replied, and watched as understanding and sorrow crossed his features. The railway tracks came into view as we crested a small hill outside the village. They stretched across the valley like twin lines of destiny, black steel rails that had been laid by Soviet engineers decades ago and maintained by whatever government happened to be in power. The 347 cargo train had been running this route for over 15 years, carrying goods from Kabul to the eastern provinces with the regularity of a clock. It had never been late, never been early, never missed a day. My father stood at the center of the tracks, directing the preparation like a military operation. Several men were checking the rail alignment, ensuring that the ropes would hold properly, making certain that there would be no chance of accidental survival. This was not meant to be quick or merciful. This was meant to be a lesson that would be remembered for generations. "Bring him forward," my father commanded, his voice steady but hollow. They forced me to walk the final 100 yards, my bound hands making it difficult to maintain balance on the uneven ground. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and I could feel sweat running down my back, despite the fear that had chilled me to the bone. The metal rails shimmered with heat, and I realized with sick dread that they would burn my skin when they pressed me against them. "Jibril ibn Muhammad," my father announced in a formal voice, using my full name as if he were reading a military citation. "You have confessed to abandoning Islam and accepting the false god of the Christians. You have brought shame upon your family, your village, and your faith. According to Islamic law and Taliban justice, you are sentenced to death." The crowd had arranged itself in a semicircle around the tracks, close enough to see everything but far enough back to avoid any danger from the approaching train. I counted maybe 200 people, including children, who should not have been witnessing such a scene, but whose parents seemed to think it would serve as valuable education about the consequences of apostasy. Village Imam stepped forward, an elderly man whose beard was white with age and whose eyes held no mercy. "Even now," he intoned, "Allah, in His infinite mercy, offers you redemption. Speak the Shahada, return to the true faith, and your life will be spared." All eyes turned to me, and I felt the weight of their expectation pressing down like a physical force. Here was my chance to live, to return to my family, to resume the life I had always known. All I had to do was speak a few words in Arabic, renounce Jesus Christ, and pretend that the last 8 months had been a temporary madness. Instead, I found myself speaking words that surprised even me. "I have already spoken my Shahada," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "There is no God but God, and Jesus Christ is His Son." The gasp that rippled through the assembly was audible. Even my father stepped back as if I had struck him. To twist the sacred words of Islam into a Christian confession was a blasphemy beyond their imagination. "Tie him down," my father ordered, his voice now devoid of any emotion except cold determination. 4 men grabbed me and forced me onto my back across the rails. The steel was indeed burning hot from the afternoon sun, and I cried out as it seared through my shirt. They stretched my arms wide and tied them to the wooden railroad ties with thick rope, then did the same with my legs. The position was designed to ensure that the train would strike my torso directly, making survival impossible. As they worked, I could hear the distant sound that would haunt my nightmares if I lived to have any more nightmares. Far off in the distance, so faint it was almost imaginary, came the whistle of the approaching train. The 3:47 cargo service from Kabul, right on schedule as always. "The train approaches," my father announced to the crowd. "Let all who witness this remember what happens to those who abandon the true faith for the lies of infidels." The crowd began to murmur and shift with anticipation. Some were placing bets on whether I would scream when I saw the train, whether I would try to break free from the ropes, whether I would call out to Jesus or to Allah in my final moments. The morbid curiosity of the human soul was on full display, and I was the entertainment. Lying there on those burning rails, feeling the rough rope cutting into my wrists and ankles, I closed my eyes and tried to pray. But my mind was chaos, spinning between terror and faith, between regret and determination. Have you ever faced certain death? I mean really faced it, knowing exactly when it is coming, able to count down the minutes until your life ends. It strips away every pretense, every comfortable lie you tell yourself about courage and faith and readiness to die for your beliefs. The train whistle sounded again, closer now, and I could feel the first faint vibrations through the steel beneath my back. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, I could see the black smoke rising above the hills. The 3:47 cargo train was coming, just as it had every day for 15 years. And today, it was coming for me. My father checked his watch again. 43 minutes, he announced. 43 minutes for this apostate to contemplate his choices, and for all of you to remember what loyalty to Islam demands. But as I lay there, counting down the moments until my death, something unexpected began to happen in my heart. The terror was still there, the physical fear of the agony that awaited me. But underneath it, growing stronger with each passing moment, was a peace that defied explanation. Jesus had not abandoned me. Even here, tied to railway tracks and facing the most horrible death imaginable, I could feel his presence with me. The train whistle sounded a third time, much closer now, and the crowd fell silent in anticipation of the final act of this terrible drama. The vibrations started as barely perceptible tremors through the steel rails beneath my back, like the faintest heartbeat of some massive, distant creature. It was 3:42 p.m., and the cargo train was still several miles away, but the tracks were already singing with its approach. The metal that had been burning my skin just moments before now carried the rhythmic pulse of tons of steel and iron bearing down on me at 50 miles per hour. I could see my father consulting his pocket watch every few seconds, his weathered face a mask of grim satisfaction. 5 minutes, he announced to the crowd. The train will arrive in exactly 5 minutes. His voice carried across the assembled villagers with the authority of a man who had orchestrated countless executions. But I caught something else in his tone, something that might have been uncertainty or even regret. The crowd had grown restless with anticipation. Children were being lifted onto their fathers' shoulders for a better view, while women clutched prayer beads and muttered verses from the Quran. Some of the men were making final wagers on whether I would break and call out for mercy, whether I would scream when I saw the train's headlight, whether I would curse Allah or cry out to Jesus in my final moments. Ahmad stood closest to me, his rifle hanging loosely in his hands, his face pale with an emotion I could not identify. "Jibril," he whispered, leaning down so only I could hear. "Please, brother, even now it is not too late. Just speak the words. Just say you renounce this madness." I looked up into his desperate eyes and saw the friend I had grown up with, the boy who had shared his bread with me when we were children, the young man who had stood beside me in battle. "Would you want me to live as a lie?" I asked him softly. He straightened up abruptly, wiping tears from his eyes, and stepped back among the other guards. I could see that my words had hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the terrible reality of what we were all participating in. The train whistle echoed across the valley again, much louder now, and the vibrations through the rails intensified noticeably. I could feel them in my bones, a steady drumbeat counting down the seconds until impact. The rope around my wrists had begun to cut into my skin, and my shoulders ached from being stretched across the wooden railroad ties. But these physical discomforts seemed trivial compared to the approaching tsunami of steel and momentum. At 3:44 p.m., the train came into view around the bend in the valley. Even at a distance of perhaps 2 miles, it looked massive and unstoppable, black smoke pouring from its stack, its headlight already visible in the afternoon sun. The engineer would not be able to see me yet, would not know that a human being was tied to his tracks, would have no reason to suspect that this routine cargo run was about to become a nightmare. "There!" my father shouted, pointing toward the approaching locomotive. "Behold the judgment of Allah upon those who abandon the true faith." The crowd pressed forward slightly, their collective intake of breath audible as they realized that this was really happening, that they were about to witness a death that would be remembered and retold for generations. I could hear my mother's voice rising above the general murmur, a wordless keening that spoke of grief beyond description. The train was perhaps a mile away now, close enough that I could make out individual cars behind the locomotive. It was a long train, maybe 30 cars loaded with grain and manufactured goods, tens of thousands of tons rolling toward me with the inevitability of an avalanche. The engineer would be checking his schedule, perhaps drinking tea from a thermos, completely unaware that in 3 minutes his locomotive would be used as an instrument of execution. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Terror battled with faith, regret warred with conviction, and underneath it all was a growing sense of unreality, as if this were happening to someone else, and I were merely observing from a distance. "Jesus," I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. "If this is how my story ends, then let it bring glory to your name." At exactly 3:45 p.m., with the train now clearly visible and perhaps half a mile away, something extraordinary began to happen. The engineer, a man I would later learn was named Rashid and had been driving trains for 23 years, suddenly felt compelled to check his brakes. He would later tell investigators that he had no rational reason for this action, that everything was functioning normally, that he had never in his career performed an unscheduled brake test in the middle of a routine run. But as the train approached within a quarter mile of my position, close enough that I could see the engineer's silhouette in the cab window, I heard a sound that should not have been possible. The screaming shriek of emergency brakes being applied at full force. Metal grinding against metal in a desperate attempt to stop tens of thousands of tons of moving steel. The crowd's murmur turned to gasps of confusion, and then to shouts of alarm. This was not part of the plan. The train was supposed to hit me at full speed, ensuring instant death and maximum impact on the watching villagers. But instead, it was slowing dramatically, throwing up showers of sparks as the brake shoes bit into the wheels. My father ran toward the tracks, his face a mixture of rage and bewilderment. "What is happening?" he shouted, as if commanding the laws of physics to obey his will. "Why is the train stopping?" Through the smoke and sparks, I could see the engineer frantically working in his cab, pulling levers and checking gauges with the desperate intensity of a man who knew something was terribly wrong, but could not understand what. The train continued to slow, its whistle now blowing in short, urgent blasts that spoke of emergency and confusion. 200 meters. 150. 100. The massive locomotive, which should have been bearing down on me at full speed, was now crawling forward like a wounded beast. I could see the engineer's face clearly now, his mouth open in shock and bewilderment, as he stared at his instruments and tried to understand why his perfectly functioning train was stopping without his command. 50 meters. 25. 10. The crowd had fallen completely silent, struck dumb by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. Even the children had stopped their chatter, sensing that they were in the presence of something beyond human understanding. And then, with a final grinding shriek of protesting metal, the locomotive came to a complete stop. The massive steel cowcatcher, designed to push obstacles off the tracks, hung directly above my head at a distance I could measure in inches. 3 feet, maybe less. Close enough that I could have reached up and touched the warm metal if my hands had been free. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. 200 people stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they had just witnessed. A fully loaded cargo train, operating normally on straight, level track, had somehow stopped itself within feet of my body without any signal from the engineer, without any mechanical failure that anyone could identify. The engineer climbed down from his cab, his legs shaking visibly, his weathered face pale with shock. 23 years, he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. 23 years I have been driving trains, and I have never seen anything like this. The brakes engaged by themselves, the throttle closed by itself. This is impossible. Ask yourself this question. What are the mathematical odds of a perfectly functioning train experiencing simultaneous, inexplicable failure of multiple systems at the exact moment needed to spare a single human life? What are the chances that a routine cargo run would become the stage for what could only be described as a miracle? I lay there on those burning rails, staring up at the massive locomotive that should have killed me, and felt something wash over me that was deeper and more powerful than any emotion I had ever experienced. It was not relief, though relief was certainly part of it. It was not vindication, though my faith had certainly been vindicated. It was something far more profound, a bone-deep certainty that the God I had chosen to follow was real, was present, and had just demonstrated his power over the laws of physics and the plans of men. That was the moment when I did not just believe in Jesus Christ, but knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly who he claimed to be. The Son of the living God, the creator of the universe, the one who spoke stars into existence and could stop a train with nothing more than his will. The train had stopped, but my real journey was just beginning. The silence that followed the train's impossible stop lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. 200 people stood frozen in shock, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Then the spell broke, and chaos erupted around me. The first person to move was my father. He strode toward the locomotive with fury blazing in his eyes, shouting at the engineer as if the man had deliberately sabotaged the execution. "What have you done?" he demanded, grabbing the bewildered train operator by his uniform. "Why did you stop? This was the judgment of Allah." The engineer, still trembling from his own inexplicable experience, pushed my father away with surprising force. "I did nothing," he protested, his voice cracking with emotion. "The train stopped itself. The brakes engaged without my command. The throttle closed by itself. In 23 years of driving, I have never seen anything like this. It is impossible." But even as my father raged and the engineer protested his innocence, I could see the fear creeping into the faces of the crowd. These were simple village people, raised on stories of divine intervention and miraculous signs. What they had just witnessed was beyond the realm of mechanical failure or human error. This was something that challenged the very foundations of their understanding of how the world worked. Ahmad was the first to approach me, his hands shaking as he began to untie the ropes that bound me to the tracks. His face was pale, and I could see tears streaming down his cheeks. "Jibril," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the confused shouting of the crowd. "What God did you pray to? What power has done this thing?" As he worked to free my wrists, I could feel the circulation return into my hands in painful waves of tingling sensation. The rope had cut deep welts into my skin, and my shoulders screamed in agony as I tried to move after being stretched across the railroad ties for nearly an hour. But these physical discomforts seemed trivial compared to the spiritual transformation that was taking place in my heart. "The same God who stopped the sun for Joshua," I said to Ahmad, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "The same Jesus who calmed the storm and raised the dead. He heard my prayer, and he answered it." Ahmad finished untying my feet and helped me sit up on the tracks. Around us, the crowd was breaking into smaller groups, arguing in heated whispers about what they had witnessed. Some were calling it a mechanical failure, desperately clinging to rational explanations. Others were openly discussing divine intervention, their voices filled with awe and terror. My mother broke away from the women who had been supporting her and ran toward me, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. She fell to her knees beside the tracks and gathered me into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "My son," she cried, "what has happened here? What God has saved you from certain death?" I looked into her tear-streaked face and saw not the condemnation I had expected, but genuine confusion and desperate hope. "Mother," I said softly, "the God of love has saved me. The God who sent his Son to die for our sins so that we might have eternal life." She pulled back as if I had struck her, her hands still gripping my shoulders. "But Allah is the only God," she whispered, the words automatic but lacking conviction. "The Quran teaches us that Jesus was only a prophet." "Then how do you explain what just happened?" I asked gently. "How do you explain a train stopping by itself at the exact moment needed to spare my life? Was this the work of chance? Was this mechanical failure?" Before she could answer, the village imam pushed through the crowd, his ancient face twisted with confusion and rage. "This is the work of Satan," he declared, his voice carrying across the assembled villagers. "The devil has intervened to save his servant and deceive the faithful." But his words rang hollow even to my ears, and I could see doubt in the faces of those who heard him. If Satan had the power to stop trains, why would he use it to save a Christian convert? The logic made no sense, and even the most devout Muslims in the crowd seemed to recognize the flaw in the imam's reasoning. My father stood beside the locomotive, staring at the massive machine as if it had personally betrayed him. The engineer was checking his instruments again, shaking his head in bewilderment as he confirmed that everything was functioning normally. There was no mechanical reason for the train to have stopped, no explanation that fit within the bounds of natural law. "We will wait," my father announced finally, his voice hollow with defeat. "We will wait for the next train." But I could see that his heart was no longer in the execution. The absolute certainty that had driven him to condemn his own son was cracking, replaced by doubt and fear of forces beyond his understanding. The man who had been a pillar of Taliban authority was now facing the possibility that he had tried to execute someone under divine protection. The crowd began to disperse, people walking away in small groups and speaking in hushed, nervous tones. Children who had come expecting to see a spectacular death were instead going home with questions that would haunt them for years. Adults who had been certain of their faith were now wrestling with doubts that threatened the very foundation of their worldview. As the villagers left, I found myself alone with my immediate family and a handful of Taliban soldiers. The engineer had climbed back into his locomotive and was preparing to continue his journey, still muttering about the impossibility of what had occurred. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the railway tracks where I should have died. Ahmad helped me to my feet, my legs unsteady after the ordeal. "Jibril," he said quietly, "I have known you since we were children. You are not a man given to lies or deception. Tell me honestly, do you truly believe that your Jesus stopped that train?" I looked into the eyes of my oldest friend and saw genuine seeking there, a hunger for truth that went beyond religious training or cultural expectation. "Ahmad," I said, placing my hand on his shoulder, "I know that Jesus stopped that train. Not believe, not hope, not wish. I know it with the same certainty that I know the sun will rise tomorrow." He was quiet for a long moment, processing my words. Then he asked the question that I knew was burning in his heart. "If your Jesus is powerful enough to stop a train, why do we fight against Christians? Why do we persecute those who follow him?" Before I could answer, my father interrupted our conversation. His face was haggard, aged by the events of the afternoon, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You have 24 hours, he said, not meeting my eyes. 24 hours to leave this place and never return. If you are still here tomorrow night, divine protection or not, I will find a way to carry out your execution." The threat was real, despite what had happened. I could see in his eyes that the miracle had shaken him but not converted him. If anything, it had made him more determined to eliminate what he saw as a supernatural threat to his authority and his faith. But I could also see something else in his expression, something that might have been love struggling against duty and tradition. My mother took my arm and led me away from the tracks, her touch gentle but urgent. "Come," she said, "we must get you away from here before the other commanders arrive. Word of what happened today will spread quickly. There are those who will see divine intervention as even more reason to kill you." As we walked back toward the village, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. The miracle had saved my life, but it had also marked me as someone dangerous, someone whose very existence challenged the religious and political order of our society. I would have to flee, leaving behind everything and everyone I had ever known. But as we passed the mosque where I had prayed as a child, as we walked through the streets where I had played and learned and grown into manhood, I felt no regret for the choice I had made. Jesus had not just saved me from the train that afternoon. He had saved my eternal soul. And that salvation was worth any earthly price I might have to pay. The next 24 hours would be the most dangerous of my life, but they would also be the beginning of a new chapter in a story that God was writing through my transformed heart. That evening, as news of the stopped train spread through 3 provinces like wildfire, I sat in my uncle's house planning my escape from the only life I had ever known. My uncle Mahmoud had not been present at the execution, but the story had reached him within hours, carried by breathless messengers who could barely believe their own words. When he looked at me across his simple wooden table, I saw a mixture of fear, awe, and desperate love in his weathered eyes. "Nephew," he said quietly, glancing toward the door to make sure we were not overheard. "What happened today at those tracks was not natural. Even those who hate Christians are saying that Allah Himself intervened to spare your life." I leaned forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was not Allah who saved me, uncle. It was Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God. He heard my prayer and demonstrated His power over creation itself." My uncle was silent for a long moment, wrestling with implications that threatened everything he had believed for 67 years. "If what you say is true," he finally said, "then everything we have been taught about Christianity is a lie." "Not everything," I replied gently. "Jesus came to fulfill the law, not to destroy it. He came to offer the forgiveness and eternal life that all the prophets pointed toward. Today He proved that He has power over life and death, over the natural world, over forces that no human being can control." Outside, I could hear voices in the street, groups of men walking past and discussing the afternoon's events in hushed, urgent tones. Some were angry, calling for my immediate execution regardless of any divine protection. Others were frightened, afraid that persecuting me further might bring divine judgment upon the entire village. A few, I was amazed to hear, were asking questions about the Christian faith that had inspired such miraculous intervention. My uncle rose and went to his window, peering through the curtain at the activity outside. "Your father's men are watching the house," reported. "He means to keep his word about a 24-hour deadline. But there are others as well, Taliban commanders from neighboring regions who have come to see the man who was saved by divine intervention." The weight of my situation was becoming clear. I was no longer just a local problem to be dealt with quietly. Word of the miracle was spreading, and with it would come attention from higher authorities who would view my survival as a threat to their religious and political control. If I remained, I would face not just execution, but interrogation and torture, designed to force me to renounce my faith publicly. "There is a way out," my uncle said, returning to the table. "My brother-in-law drives supplies to the Pakistani border twice a month. His next trip is tomorrow before dawn. If you can reach his compound without being seen, he can hide you among the grain sacks." I felt a surge of gratitude mixed with overwhelming sadness. This man was risking his own life to help me escape, knowing that if we were discovered, he too would face charges of aiding an apostate. "Uncle, why are you helping me? You know what this could cost you and your family." He was quiet for a moment, his calloused hands folded on the table between us. "Because what I saw today cannot be explained by anything in our teaching," he said finally. "If your Jesus has the power to stop a speeding train to save one man's life, then perhaps there is truth in what you believe that I have never understood." Around midnight, my mother arrived at my uncle's house, moving like a shadow through the darkened streets. Her face was streaked with tears, and she carried a small bundle of clothing and food for my journey. When she embraced me, I felt her whole body shaking with grief and fear. "My son," she whispered, "I do not understand what happened today, but I cannot bear to lose you forever. Promise me that wherever you go, whatever God you choose to follow, you will remember that your mother loves you." I held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of bread and spices that always clung to her clothing. "Mother, the God I serve taught me to honor my father and mother. No matter how far I travel, no matter what happens to me, I will always love you, and pray for the day when we can be reunited." She pulled back and looked into my eyes, searching for something I could not name. "This Jesus you follow, does he really offer forgiveness for all sins? Even for a mother who failed to protect her son? Especially for mothers who love their children enough to risk their own safety to help them escape," I replied. "Jesus loves you, mother, more than you can possibly imagine. He died on a cross so that you could have eternal life and peace that surpasses all understanding." Before she could respond, we heard urgent whispers outside. My uncle appeared at the door, his face grim with tension. "Taliban patrol approaching," he hissed. "We must leave now if we are going to reach my brother-in-law's compound before they search this house." My mother pressed a small object into my hand, and I felt the familiar weight of her prayer beads, worn smooth by decades of use. "Take these," she said, "not to pray to Allah, but to remember that someone in this world loves you enough to give you her most precious possession." I tucked the beads into my pocket, knowing that I would treasure them not as religious objects, but as reminders of a mother's sacrificial love. Then my uncle led us out the back door and into the maze of narrow alleys that connected the houses of our village. The journey to the compound took 2 hours, moving carefully from shadow to shadow, avoiding the main streets where Taliban patrols were searching house by house. Twice we had to hide in doorways while armed men passed within feet of our hiding places. The entire time, I found myself praying not just for our safety, but for the men who were hunting me, that somehow God would touch their hearts and open their eyes to his truth. My uncle's brother-in-law, a weathered man named Hassan, greeted us with nervous but genuine hospitality. He had already heard about the afternoon's events, and while he was clearly frightened by the implications of helping me, he was also moved by what he saw as divine intervention on my behalf. "I have made space among the grain sacks," he told us, leading us to his truck. "The border crossing is routine, but you must remain completely silent and still. If the guards discover you, we will all face execution." As dawn approached and Hassan prepared for the dangerous journey to Pakistan, I said goodbye to the only life I had ever known. My uncle embraced me one final time, whispering a prayer in my ear that sounded suspiciously like he was addressing Jesus rather than Allah. My mother held me until Hassan gently told us it was time to go. Hiding in that truck among sacks of grain and rice, feeling every bump and pothole as we approached the border, I reflected on the incredible events of the past day. 24 hours earlier, I had been a condemned man facing certain death. Now I was a living testimony to the power and love of Jesus Christ, carrying with me a story that would challenge hearts and minds wherever I shared it. The border crossing was tense but uneventful. Pakistani guards, accustomed to routine supply deliveries, conducted only a cursory inspection before waving us through. When Hassan finally told me it was safe to emerge from my hiding place, I found myself standing on foreign soil for the first time in my life, a refugee with nothing but the clothes on my back and a faith that had been tested by fire and proven true. Look into your own heart right now and ask yourself this question. What would it take for you to believe that Jesus Christ is exactly who he claims to be? I had to face death by train to discover that truth, but you do not. The same Jesus who stopped a locomotive to save one doubting soul is reaching out
to you today with love that transcends understanding and power that conquers every fear. As I stood there in the Pakistani dawn, breathing the air of freedom for the first time as a Christian, I made a promise that I have kept every day since. I promised to share this story, to tell everyone who would listen about the God who performs miracles not just in ancient times, but today, for anyone who calls out to him in faith. The train had stopped, but my journey in faith was just beginning.